She was only 7 years old when she learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. They wear smiles. They hold positions of trust. They tell you it's a secret. When tiny Autumn finally found the courage to speak, she didn't go to the police. She didn't tell her teacher. She walked straight into the Iron Wolves clubhouse and said 6 words that would bring a grown man to tears. He said it wouldn't hurt anymore. What the bikers discovered next would expose the darkest secret their town had ever kept, and the justice they delivered. The law never saw it coming. Before we dive in, do me a favor, comment below, and let me know where you're watching from. What state? What town? Because this story needs to reach every corner of this country, and I want to know you're out there listening. Drop your location in the comments right now, then settle in. This story is going to take some time to tell, and every minute matters. Before we dive in, do me a favor, comment below, and let me know where you're watching from. What state? What town? Because this story needs to reach every corner of this country, and I want to know you're out there listening. Drop your location in the comments right now, then settle in. This story is going to take some time to tell, and every minute matters. There are places in this country where time moves differently, where Main Street still means something, where everybody knows your name, and your business, and the business of your parents before you. Redemption Falls, Montana is one of those places. Population 3,200 souls. Give or take a dozen, depending on the season. Nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Range, it's the kind of town where Friday night lights matter, where the diner serves coffee that's been brewing since dawn, and where secrets have a way of staying buried beneath layers of politeness and Sunday morning handshakes. For 15 years, the rumble of Harley-Davidson engines has been part of the soundtrack of this town. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club made Redemption Falls their home back in 2010, setting up their clubhouse in an old mechanic's garage on the edge of town, right where Main Street gives way to Mountain Highway. 8 core members. Leather cuts adorned with patches that told stories most folks didn't want to know. Men with hard faces and harder histories. Men who'd seen things that left marks deeper than the ink on their arms. The good people of Redemption Falls didn't quite know what to make of the Iron Wolves at first. Mothers pulled their children a little closer when the bikes roared past. Church ladies whispered behind their hymn books. The sheriff made it clear he'd be watching. But here's the thing about small towns. They have a way of taking your measure not by what you say, but by what you do. And what the Iron Wolves did, year after year, was show up. They showed up when the elementary school needed a new roof and the budget came up short. They showed up every December with bikes loaded down with toys for kids who might not otherwise see Christmas morning. They showed up when old Mrs. Patterson's house flooded and she had nowhere to go, rebuilding her porch with their own hands and their own money. So an understanding formed, unspoken but solid as mountain stone. The Iron Wolves were feared, yes. Respected, certainly. But trusted? That was a bridge most folks in Redemption Falls weren't quite ready to cross. They were grateful for the charity work, sure. But these were still men who lived outside the lines. Men whose loyalty ran to their brotherhood before it ran to any law written in books. They were the kind of men you appreciated from a distance, the kind you nodded to on the street but didn't invite to Sunday dinner. In a town called Redemption Falls, redemption would take a form nobody expected. Because the Iron Wolves had seen darkness before in their lives, had walked through valleys that would break lesser men. They'd buried brothers. They'd fought wars, both foreign and personal. They'd stared down their own demons and come out the other side scarred, but standing. But nothing in their collective history, nothing in all those miles logged on lonely highways and all those nights spent watching each other's backs, could have prepared them for what walked through their clubhouse door on a Tuesday night in October. Nothing could have prepared them for the test that would finally answer the question this town had been asking for 15 years. Who were the Iron Wolves, really? And when it mattered most, when innocence itself hung in the balance, which side of the line would they stand on? The answer would change everything. Every small town has its bright spots, those souls who seem to carry a little more light than the rest of us. In Redemption Falls, one of those lights was a 7-year-old girl named Autumn Grace Mitchell. 4th grade at Redemption Elementary, sitting in the 3rd row by the window where she could watch the seasons change through glass streaked with fingerprints and dreams. Autumn was the kind of child teachers remember years later. The kind who raised her hand not to show off, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. The kind who noticed when someone sat alone at lunch and made room at her table. Her mother, Victoria, worked double shifts at Mercy General Hospital 40 minutes down the highway, pulling emergency room rotations that would break most people. Single motherhood wasn't something Victoria had planned, but it was something she'd mastered with the fierce determination that runs in women who refuse to let circumstances define them. Autumn's father had left before her second birthday, deciding that responsibility didn't suit him the way freedom did. Victoria never spoke ill of him, not once. She simply worked harder, loved deeper, and made sure her daughter never felt the absence as anything but his loss. Their little house on Maple Street wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where the linoleum curled at the edges, a porch that creaked when you walked across it. But Victoria had made it a home. Autumn's room was painted the color of sunshine, walls covered with her artwork taped up like a gallery dedicated to childhood wonder. And oh, how that child could draw. She had a gift, the kind you can't teach, only nurture. Her teachers said she saw the world differently, more vividly. While other children drew stick figures and houses with triangle roofs, Autumn created entire worlds with her colored pencils and markers. Butterflies. That was her obsession, her passion, the subject she returned to again and again. She drew them in every color imaginable, and some that existed only in her imagination. Monarchs with wings like stained glass windows. Blue morphos that seemed to shimmer even on paper. Swallowtails dancing across pages torn from her sketchbook. She'd check out library books about butterflies until the librarian knew her by name and her preference. She'd spend hours in the backyard during summer, watching them drift from flower to flower, studying the way light caught their wings. Victoria had promised that when Autumn turned 8, they'd take a trip to the Butterfly Conservatory in Missoula, a 4-hour drive that would be worth every mile. That light in Autumn's eyes, that joy that seemed to radiate from her like heat from summer pavement, it was real. It was pure. And those drawings, those beautiful butterflies that covered every surface in her room and filled folder after folder in her closet, they would later reveal the truth that everyone had missed. The truth that had been right there in front of them, hiding in plain sight, drawn in the trembling hand of a child trying desperately to tell a story she didn't yet have words for. But 3 months before our story begins, something changed. If you'd walked into Autumn's room in July, you would have seen transformation and flight and freedom captured in crayon and watercolor. But by September, if you'd looked closely, if you'd really paid attention, you would have noticed something different. The butterflies in Autumn's drawings started to look darker. Their wings weren't spread in flight anymore. They were folded, pressed closed. She began drawing cages around them, thin bars sketched in pencil, sometimes so light you could barely see them. Sometimes the butterflies had broken wings. Sometimes they weren't butterflies at all anymore, just dark shapes that might have been butterflies once, before something happened that changed them. The light in Autumn's eyes began to dim like a lamp slowly losing power. She started having nightmares that left her screaming for her mother. She stopped raising her hand in class. She sat alone at lunch now, at the table by the wall where nobody could sit behind her. Victoria noticed. Of course she noticed. She asked the questions mothers ask. She held her daughter close and smoothed her hair and promised that everything was okay, that whatever was wrong, they'd face it together. But Autumn only shook her head and said she was fine, just tired, just growing up. And Victoria, working those double shifts to keep food on the table and heat in the house, wanted so desperately to believe her. The truth was waiting. It was patient, and it was so much worse than anyone could have imagined. In any brotherhood, there are men who lead and men who protect. Raymond Cole was both. At 47, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd seen combat and come home, but not unscathed. Never unscathed. His brothers in the Iron Wolves called him Guardian, and the name wasn't irony or accident. It was prophecy wearing leather. Road captain of the club, second in command, the man who planned the routes and watched the flanks and made sure everyone came home in one piece. That was his nature. That was his calling. That was the thing that defined him even before the army taught him how to channel it into something useful. 23 years he'd served as an Army Ranger. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 2 in Iraq. Places where the sand got in everything and the heat pressed down like judgment, and you learned real quick that the only thing keeping you alive was the man next to you and your willingness to do the same for him. He'd earned his Purple Heart the hard way, taking shrapnel meant for a younger soldier who had a wife and a baby girl waiting back home. Guardian had spent 6 weeks in a hospital in Germany, and when they asked him if he had any regrets, he looked them dead in the eye and said the only regret he had was not moving faster. He'd come home to Montana with medals he kept in a drawer and memories he kept in a locked room in his mind that he only opened late at night when the whiskey was flowing and the clubhouse was quiet. He'd met Sarah at a VA support group, a nurse who understood what it meant to see too much, to carry too much. They'd married within a year. And when Emily was born, with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn determination, Guardian discovered that everything he'd been protecting all those years, everything he'd fought for in deserts half a world away, it all came down to this. This tiny human who depended on him completely. This perfect soul who called him daddy and believed he could fix anything. He'd taught Emily to ride a bike on a Sunday morning in June, running beside her with his hand on the seat, steady and sure, telling her he wouldn't let go until she was ready. She'd been 6 years old, all knobby knees and determination, her training wheels sitting in the garage like discarded armor. She'd wobbled and shrieked and laughed, and when she finally found her balance, when she finally pedaled away from him on her own power, she looked back over her shoulder with a smile so bright it could have lit the whole valley. That's when he'd let go. That's when he'd watched her fly. 2 years later, Emily was gone. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors had used words like aggressive and unfortunate, and sometimes these things just happen. But Guardian had heard different words. Words like failure and too late and we're sorry. He'd held his daughter's hand through chemotherapy that stole her hair and her strength, but never her smile. He'd read her stories about butterflies and dragons and girls who were braver than any soldier. And when she'd taken her last breath, 8 years old and so very tired, Guardian had made her a promise. He'd promised that her life would mean something. That he'd find a way to honor her memory by protecting other children the way he couldn't protect her. The Toys for Tots program was his penance and his purpose. Every December, Guardian transformed the clubhouse into Santa's workshop on wheels. He coordinated with schools, organized donation drives, sorted teddy bears and baby dolls and action figures with the precision of a military operation. His brothers respected it, even the ones who grumbled about going soft. They saw the way Guardian's jaw tightened when he held a pink bicycle mint for a girl around Emily's age. They understood that some wounds don't heal, they just teach you how to carry the weight differently. 5 years Guardian had spent trying to make peace with his daughter's death. 5 years of wondering if anything he did mattered, if toy drives and charity events could ever balance the scales of a universe that would take a child before her 9th birthday. He had no idea that saving one little girl would finally give him the redemption he'd been seeking. He had no idea that everything he'd survived, everything he'd lost, everything he'd learned about protecting the innocent, it was all preparation for what was coming. If you've ever lost someone and tried to honor their memory by helping others, you understand what drove Guardian. You understand that sometimes grief doesn't destroy us, it transforms us. It gives us a mission. And Guardian's mission was about to take a turn that would restore your faith in what humanity can be when we choose to stand between innocence and evil. The choice was coming, and Guardian had already spent 5 years preparing to make it. Every community has pillars, people who hold things together, people you can count on. In Redemption Falls, Mitchell Brennan was exactly that kind of man. 38 years old, athletic build kept trim from coaching youth soccer and running the town's 5K charity race every spring. Clean cut, well-spoken, the kind of smile that reached his eyes when parents were watching. He'd grown up 2 towns over, moved to Redemption Falls fresh out of college with a teaching degree and ambitions to make a difference. 15 years he'd been part of the fabric of this community. 15 years of building trust, one small interaction at a time. Coach Brennan, they called him, even when he wasn't on the soccer field. He substitute taught at Redemption Elementary 3 days a week, filling in for teachers who were sick or on maternity leave. The kids loved him because he made learning feel like play. The parents loved him because their children came home excited about math or science or whatever subject he'd covered that day. The principal loved him because he was reliable, always willing to take on extra duties, always volunteering for the field trips and after-school programs that other teachers tried to avoid. In 2022, the Chamber of Commerce named him Volunteer of the Year. There'd been a ceremony at the community center, cake and punch, and a plaque with his name engraved in brass. The mayor had shaken his hand. The newspaper had run a photo of him surrounded by smiling children, all wearing matching soccer jerseys he'd helped fundraise for. The article called him a hometown hero, a man dedicated to shaping young lives. His trophy case at home held awards for coaching championships, certificates of appreciation from the PTA, letters of commendation from grateful parents whose children he'd tutored for free. Because that was his special gift, wasn't it? His willingness to give extra time to children who needed help. His after-school tutoring program operated out of classroom 12 every Tuesday and Thursday, 3:30 to 5 o'clock. Reading comprehension, math fundamentals, study skills, whatever a child needed, Coach Brennan provided. He never charged a dime. He did it, he said, because every child deserved a chance to succeed, and some kids just needed a little extra attention to reach their potential. Parents signed their children up eagerly. Single mothers like Victoria, working double shifts and unable to afford private tutoring, saw it as a blessing. Their children would get individual attention from a man who'd proven himself trustworthy 1,000 times over. A man who coached their teams. A man who showed up at church on Sundays. A man who everyone knew and everyone respected. Autumn had been in his special helper program since the start of the school year. She'd been struggling with reading comprehension, getting distracted easily, and Victoria had jumped at the opportunity when Coach Brennan suggested the extra tutoring. He'd been so understanding, so kind. He'd told Victoria that Autumn was a bright girl who just needed someone to help her focus. He'd even given Autumn special duties, making her feel important. She got to help him organize supplies. She got to stay a few minutes after the other tutoring students left to tidy up the classroom. Just the two of them. Private time with a trusted adult who told her she was special. He'd been so careful with his words, too, warning her about strangers, teaching her about danger. Specifically, he told her to be wary of certain types of men. Men who rode motorcycles, for instance. Men who wore leather and lived outside the rules. Those bikers everyone saw around town, the Iron Wolves. Coach Brennan had explained to Autumn that men like that were dangerous. Men like that hurt little girls. If she ever felt scared, if she ever needed help, she should never, ever go to men like that. She should come to him. Only him. He was safe. He would protect her. Mitchell Brennan had perfected his mask over 15 years. He knew how to choose his targets. Children from single-parent homes. Children whose mothers worked long hours. Children who were hungry for attention and validation. He knew how to ensure their silence. Through fear, through shame, through twisted logic that made them feel responsible, through careful warnings about who they could and couldn't trust. And he knew that in a small town like Redemption Falls, no one would ever suspect a man who coached Little League and volunteered at church. No one would believe a child over a man with a trophy case and a plaque from the Chamber of Commerce. He made only one miscalculation. He underestimated a little girl's courage. And he never imagined that the very men he'd taught her to fear, the men he'd warned her against, the Iron Wolves he'd painted as monsters, he never imagined they would become her champions. That mistake would cost him everything, and it would prove that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like heroes. Sometimes they wear smiles and carry whistles and get their names in the newspaper. And sometimes, just sometimes, the real heroes are the ones everyone warned you about. October 17th fell on a Tuesday. The kind of autumn day Montana does best, when the aspens have turned gold and the air carries that first sharp promise of winter. School let out at 3:15, and by 3:30, Autumn was sitting in classroom 12 with 4 other students, opening her workbook to the page Coach Brennan had assigned. This was the routine. This had been the routine for 3 months now. 3 months that had transformed her from the inside out in ways no 7-year-old should ever have to understand. The nightmares had started in late July, shortly after tutoring began. Autumn would wake up screaming, tangled in sheets damp with sweat, and when Victoria rushed to her bedside, the girl couldn't explain what she'd seen in her sleep. Only that someone was chasing her. Only that she couldn't get away. Only that she felt trapped. Victoria would hold her daughter until the trembling stopped, stroking her hair and singing lullabies that used to work when Autumn was smaller. But nothing worked anymore. The nightmares came 3, 4, 5 times a week. By September, Autumn had stopped hugging her mother goodbye in the mornings. She flinched when Victoria tried to brush her hair. She refused to hold hands in the parking lot. Touch, any touch, had become something to avoid, something that made her skin crawl and her stomach twist. Victoria had asked her pediatrician about it. worried about sensory issues or anxiety disorders. The doctor had said it was probably just a phase, that children go through stages of independence. Give it time, the doctor had said. She'll come back to you. But Autumn wasn't becoming independent. She was disappearing into herself, folding inward like those butterflies she drew with their wings pressed shut. Victoria noticed, but didn't understand. She asked questions that Autumn answered with quiet lies. She trusted that if something was truly wrong, her bright, talkative daughter would tell her. And she trusted Coach Brennan, who assured her that Autumn was making progress, that she just needed patience and consistency. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the tutoring sessions had become something else entirely once the other students left at 4:30. That the special helper duties had crossed lines that should never be crossed. That Coach Brennan's kind voice had become commanding, then threatening. That he'd been so careful, so methodical, building trust before breaking it, normalizing the abnormal, making Autumn believe this was her fault, her secret to keep, her shame to carry. On October 17th, something shifted. The other students gathered their backpacks at 4:30 and filed out, calling goodbye to Coach Brennan, who smiled and reminded them about Thursday's session. The door clicked shut. The hallway grew quiet. And when Coach Brennan turned back to Autumn with that look in his eyes, the look that made her want to run but her legs wouldn't move, she knew what was coming. She always knew. But this time was different. This time, the pain was sharp and immediate and undeniable. This time, when she whimpered that it hurt, when she begged him to stop, he'd whispered the same thing he always whispered, that it wouldn't hurt, that she was being dramatic, that if she just relaxed it would be fine. But he was wrong. It did hurt. It hurt in ways that 7-year-olds shouldn't have words for, hurt in ways that would leave marks invisible to everyone except the girl who carried them. When it was finally over, when Coach Brennan had straightened his shirt and reminded her that good girls keep secrets and that dangerous men like those bikers would hurt her worse if she ever told, Autumn nodded. She always nodded. But something had broken inside her, or maybe something had finally become clear. The fear that had kept her silent for 3 months was still there, heavy as a stone in her chest. But underneath it, rising like water through cracks in concrete, was something else, something fiercer, something that whispered that this couldn't continue, that she couldn't survive another Tuesday, another Thursday, another session in classroom 12. She remembered last December, the toy drive at the elementary school. Men on motorcycles unloading boxes of gifts, their leather cuts bearing the wolf patch everyone recognized. Most of the children had hung back, intimidated by their size and their scars and their rough voices. But Autumn had watched one of them, a tall man with gray at his temples, kneel down to a kindergartner who'd been crying. She'd watched his face transform, watched gentleness replace the hard lines. She'd seen his eyes, and they'd been kind. Sad, but kind. Coach Brennan had told her those men were dangerous. He'd warned her never to trust them, never to go near them. But Coach Brennan had also told her that what he was doing wouldn't hurt. Coach Brennan had lied about everything else. Maybe he'd lied about that too. What Autumn didn't know, couldn't have known as she walked out of classroom 12 that afternoon with her backpack weighing less than the secret she carried, was that walking into the Iron Wolves clubhouse would set off a chain reaction that would expose not just one predator, but an entire network that had operated in the shadows for over a decade. She didn't know that her courage would save other children. She didn't know that the men everyone feared would become the warriors she needed. All she knew was that she couldn't do this alone anymore. All she knew was that someone had to help her. And sometimes, when you're 7 years old and the whole world feels like it's closing in, you have to trust your instincts over the words of adults who've proven themselves to be liars. Sometimes you have to bet everything on kind eyes you saw once at a Christmas toy drive. Sometimes that's all the hope you have left. By 6:30 that evening, darkness had settled over Redemption Falls the way it does in October, early and complete, swallowing the mountains and turning Main Street into a corridor of streetlights and neon signs. Victoria had dropped Autumn at the public library for what she thought was a school project meeting, kissing her daughter's forehead and promising to pick her up at 7:30. The library was 4 blocks from the Iron Wolves clubhouse. For blocks that Autumn walked alone, her small sneakers scuffing against sidewalk, her breath making clouds in the cold air, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The clubhouse sat at the edge of town where respectability gave way to reality, a converted garage with cinder block walls and a gravel parking lot that crunched under the weight of 8 Harley-Davidsons lined up like chrome soldiers. Lights spilled from the windows, yellow and warm against the darkness. Music drifted out, classic rock playing low enough to be background, loud enough to be felt. The Iron Wolves flag hung above the entrance, a wolf's head in profile, teeth bared, rendered in black and silver. To most people in Redemption Falls, this place represented everything they feared about the margins of society. To Autumn, walking toward it with trembling legs and clenched fists, it represented the only chance she had left. Inside, the clubhouse was exactly what you'd expect, and nothing like what the rumors suggested. Leather and chrome, yes. A bar running along one wall lined with bottles that caught the light. Pool table in the corner, balls racked and waiting. Motorcycle parts scattered on workbenches, works in progress that would eventually roar back to life. Photographs on the walls of brothers on bikes, of charity events and poker runs, and fallen members whose memories lived on in framed smiles. It smelled like motor oil and leather and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. 8 men sat around a table in the center of the room, club meeting in session, discussing routes for next month's Veterans Memorial Ride. Hammer, the club president, sat at the head of the table. 52 years old, built like his name suggested, with hands that had broken bones and repaired engines, and held dying brothers on battlefields most Americans couldn't find on a map. He was mid-sentence when he noticed the door opening, noticed the small figure silhouetted against the darkness outside, noticed the way she hesitated on the threshold like a sparrow about to fly into a lion's den. The conversation died. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward the child standing in their doorway. She was tiny, even for 7, wearing a purple jacket with a broken zipper and jeans that were getting too short for her growing legs. Her dark hair hung loose around a face that was too pale, too drawn, eyes too old for her age. But it was those eyes that stopped Hammer cold. Terror, yes. He'd seen terror before in 1,000 different contexts. But mixed with it was something else. Desperate determination. The look of someone who'd already made an impossible decision and was now living with the consequences. For Guardian, sitting 3 chairs down from Hammer, time did something strange. One moment, he was looking at a frightened child in a doorway. The next moment, the light shifted or his memory betrayed him or his heart simply couldn't help itself, and he saw Emily standing there. His daughter. His girl. The one he'd failed to protect from cancer and fate and the cruelty of a universe that takes children before their time. The resemblance wasn't physical. This girl looked nothing like Emily. But something in her posture, something in the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. That was his daughter standing in a hospital room, trying to be brave for him, even though he was supposed to be brave for her. Then Guardian blinked, and Emily was gone. Just a ghost made of grief and poor lighting, and what remained was a living child who needed help. A child who had walked alone into a motorcycle clubhouse because somewhere in her calculations of fear and hope, she'd decided this was safer than wherever she'd been. Hammer pushed back from the table slowly, carefully, moving the way you move around wounded animals or people balanced on the edge of breaking. He kept his hands visible, kept his voice soft. The other brothers stayed seated, stayed quiet, letting their president handle this because that's what presidents do. They navigate the unexpected. They make the calls that matter. The little girl took one step inside, then another. The door swung shut behind her, and suddenly she was fully in their world, surrounded by leather and chrome and men whose reputations she'd certainly heard about. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Her voice when it came was barely a whisper, but in the silence of that clubhouse, every man heard every word. She was looking for Guardian. She didn't know his name, only that he was the tall one with the gray hair who'd been kind to a kindergartner last December. She'd come to tell someone what had happened. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go. In that moment, every man in that room became something they never expected to be. Not outlaws, not rebels, not the dangerous men respectable people warned their children about. They became the last line of defense for a child the system had failed to protect. They became the only ones paying attention. They became the difference between one more silent victim and a voice that would finally be heard. If you believe that real men protect children, you need to understand what happened next. Because what these bikers did, the law couldn't do. The community wouldn't do. But the Iron Wolves were about to show their town what justice really looks like, when you strip away the bureaucracy and the politics and the fear of rocking boats. They were about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who change everything. Hit subscribe if you want to see how this unfolds. Comment, protect the innocent, if you stand with them. Because courage doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it's a 7-year-old girl walking into a biker clubhouse. And sometimes it's 8 men who decide that protecting her matters more than protecting themselves. The truth was about to come out. And nothing in Redemption Falls would ever be the same. Autumn's feet carried her across that clubhouse floor, past the pool table and the bar and the photographs of men on motorcycles, past the brothers who sat frozen at their table watching her approach. She moved like someone walking through water, every step requiring more courage than the last. Her eyes were locked on Guardian, the man with the gray hair and the sad eyes, the man who'd knelt for a crying kindergartner when everyone else had kept their distance. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. She only knew that when she'd seen him last December, she'd seen something that Coach Brennan had told her didn't exist in men like him. She'd seen gentleness. The room had gone silent in a way that went beyond the absence of sound. It was the silence of held breath, of men who'd been in combat and knew that this moment mattered, that whatever happened next would change the trajectory of everything. Guardian watched her come, watched this tiny girl carrying something too heavy for her small frame, and every instinct screaming at him to move, to help, to fix whatever was broken. She stopped 3 feet from where he sat, close enough to speak, far enough to run if she needed to. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white with pressure. Her voice when she finally spoke was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through that silence like a blade through skin. He said it wouldn't hurt anymore. But he lied. Coach Brennan lied. Guardian didn't think. Thinking would have required time he didn't have, distance he couldn't afford. He dropped to his knees on that concrete floor hard enough that the impact would leave bruises he'd carry for days. Dropped until he was eye level with her, until he could see the tears pooling in her eyes and the trembling in her jaw, and the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will that no child should have to possess. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by emotion he hadn't felt in 5 years. You're safe now. Whatever you need to tell me, I'm listening. We're all listening. Behind him, the other brothers remained motionless. Hammer had gone very still in the way dangerous men do when they're calculating violence. The others sat with fists clenched on the table, jaws tight, eyes fixed on this little girl who'd walked into their world carrying a truth that was already reshaping the air in the room, making it thick and hard to breathe. Autumn looked at Guardian, really looked at him, searching his face for something she desperately needed to find. Whatever she saw there must have been enough because she started talking. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking under pressure it was never meant to hold. She told them about the tutoring sessions, about staying late, about Coach Brennan's special helper program, and how special had stopped meaning good and started meaning terrible. About the things he'd done, the ways he'd touched her, the words he'd whispered that made her feel like she was drowning even though her head was above water. Guardian's brothers would later say they'd never seen anything harder than watching him listen to that confession. They'd served with him in combat zones. They'd seen him take hits that would drop lesser men. They'd watched him bury his daughter and somehow keep standing. But listening to this 7-year-old girl describe violations that no child should endure, no child should have words for, that brought him to a breaking point they'd never witnessed. Autumn told them about the nightmares and the fear of being touched and how she couldn't hug her mother anymore because touch meant danger now, meant pain, meant secrets she had to keep or something worse would happen. She told them how Coach Brennan had warned her about men like them, about dangerous bikers who hurt little girls, and how she believed him for a long time. But then she told them about today, about the pain that had finally broken through her trained silence, and how she'd realized that the man everyone trusted was the monster, and maybe the monsters everyone feared were actually the ones who could save her. She reached into her backpack with trembling hands and pulled out a piece of paper, folded multiple times until it was small enough to hide. She unfolded it carefully and held it out to Guardian. It was one of her drawings. A butterfly, rendered in colored pencil with the skill of a child who saw beauty even in darkness. But this butterfly's wings were broken, bent at angles that defied nature. And around it, drawn in black marker with heavy, desperate strokes, was a cage. Bars that trapped it, imprisoned it, kept it from flying. Guardian took the drawing with hands that shook. He'd seen violence in a dozen countries. He'd seen death up close and personal. But this piece of paper, this child's attempt to communicate a truth she didn't have adequate language for, this destroyed him in ways combat never had. The tears came without permission, tracking down his weathered face, dripping onto the drawing he held like it was sacred. His brothers watched him cry for the first time since Emily's funeral, watched this man they'd followed into hell and back break open with grief and rage and a protective love that transcended biology. Hammer stood slowly, every muscle in his body coiled tight, with barely restrained fury. His voice when he spoke was low and controlled, which made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "Does your mother know?" Autumn shook her head. She tried to tell Victoria once, weeks ago, but the words had gotten stuck and Coach Brennan's warnings about what would happen if she told had rung louder than her courage. Victoria worked so hard. Victoria trusted Coach Brennan. Victoria would blame herself. Autumn couldn't bear to see her mother's face break the way Guardian's had just broken. The other brothers had risen from the table now, forming an unconscious circle of protection around this child who'd stumbled into their sanctuary. Doc, the club's medic, stepped forward carefully. "Sweetheart, we need to get you checked by a doctor. We need to document what happened to you. And we need to tell your mom, because she loves you and she needs to know so she can protect you." Autumn started to protest, panic flashing across her face, but Guardian caught her attention. "Your mother isn't going to be angry at you. None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? None of it. What that man did, that's on him. The blame lives with him. You did nothing wrong." The Iron Wolves had a code, a brotherhood forged in loyalty and blood, in miles logged on lonely highways and battles fought side by side. They had rules about respect and territory and honor among thieves. But in that moment, looking at this broken child who'd been brave enough to seek help from the men everyone told her to fear, they added a new oath to their code. An unspoken vow that passed between 8 men without a single word being said. No child would ever be harmed in their town again. They would become the Watchers, the Protectors, the last line of defense for the innocent. What they were about to do would either save them or destroy them. It would make them heroes or criminals depending on whose definition you accepted. It would test every principle they'd built their brotherhood on and force them to choose between the law as it was written and justice as it should be delivered. But standing in that clubhouse with a 7-year-old girl who'd just shattered their evening with a truth that demanded action, there was no hesitation. There was no debate. There was only the certainty that comes when you finally understand what you were put on this earth to do. Guardian pulled Autumn into a careful embrace, mindful of her fear of touch, but unable to stop himself from offering comfort the only way he knew how. She stiffened for a moment, then melted into him, sobbing against his leather cut with the force of 3 months of held-back tears. And over her head, Guardian looked at his brothers and saw his own rage reflected back at him 8 times over. They had work to do, a child to protect, a monster to stop, and a town to wake up from its willful blindness. The reckoning was coming, and the Iron Wolves were going to deliver it. Getting Autumn home to Victoria required careful planning and gentle handling. Doc drove his truck, the least intimidating vehicle in the club's arsenal, while Guardian sat in the back seat with Autumn, who'd finally stopped crying but couldn't stop shaking. They'd called Victoria from the clubhouse, told her there'd been an incident, and they needed to bring her daughter home immediately. The confusion in Victoria's voice had been painful to hear, but not as painful as what was coming. When Victoria opened her front door and saw her daughter's face, saw the tear tracks and the hollow eyes and the way Autumn was holding Guardian's hand like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth, something inside her shattered. She knew. Before a single word was spoken, she knew. Mothers always know, even when they've been trying desperately not to. The confession happened again, this time with Victoria on her knees in front of her daughter, listening to words that turned her world inside out. Coach Brennan, the man she'd trusted, the man she'd thanked for helping her daughter, the man who'd smiled at her in the grocery store just last week and asked how Autumn was doing. That man had been destroying her child while she worked double shifts to pay bills and put food on the table. The guilt hit Victoria like a physical blow, doubling her over, making her gasp for air between sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Guardian and Doc stayed until Victoria's sister arrived from across town, stayed until Autumn was tucked into bed with her aunt sitting vigil. stayed until Victoria had stopped apologizing to her daughter for failing to protect her and started asking the questions that mattered. What happens now? Who do we tell? How do we make this right? By 11 that night, the clubhouse was full again. Emergency meeting, all brothers present, the kind of gathering that happened when the club faced an existential threat or an opportunity that required unanimous consent. They sat around that same table where Autumn had confessed hours earlier, but the energy in the room had transformed from shock to something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Doc, the vice president and the club's voice of reason, spoke first. We go to the police. Tonight. We document everything. We get Autumn to a hospital for a forensic exam. We build a case that's airtight. We do this by the book. It was the right answer. The legal answer. The answer that kept them on the right side of the law and gave Autumn the best chance at justice through proper channels. But Guardian was already shaking his head before Doc finished speaking. Brennan's father is Thomas Brennan, senior partner at the biggest law firm in the county. The man has judges in his pocket and connections that go all the way to the state capitol. You think his son is going to see the inside of a cell? You think a 7-year-old girl's testimony is going to hold up against a team of lawyers who'll paint her as confused, mistaken, coached by her mother or us? This is Redemption Falls. This is a town that named that bastard Volunteer of the Year. They won't want to believe it. They'll find reasons not to. The table erupted in overlapping voices, brothers arguing both sides with passion that came from places deeper than logic. But Hammer raised one hand, and the room fell silent, because that's what happened when Hammer decided to speak. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made the fury underneath it more apparent. My niece was 14 when her soccer coach started grooming her. Different town, similar situation. Beloved coach, respected man, nobody wanted to believe it. She finally found the courage to tell her parents. They went to the police, built a case, went to trial. You know what he got? 6 months in county jail. 6 months for destroying a child's innocence, for stealing years of therapy and nightmares and trust issues she'll carry forever. 6 months because he had no prior record and the judge believed he deserved a second chance. My niece tried to kill herself 3 times before her 18th birthday. That coach is out now, coaching again. Different town, different kids. The silence that followed Hammer's revelation was absolute. Every man at that table understood what he was really saying. The system was broken. The system protected predators more effectively than it protected children. The system would fail Autumn the same way it had failed Hammer's niece and thousands of other victims whose stories never made headlines because justice never came. But Doc wasn't backing down. So what's the alternative? We handle it ourselves? We become vigilantes? That makes us criminals. That destroys the club. That potentially destroys any legal case Autumn might have. It was Guardian who'd spent the 3 hours between dropping Autumn home and returning to the clubhouse doing research. He opened his laptop and turned it so the brothers could see the screen. Mitchell Brennan taught in Whitefish before he came here. Before that, Kalispell. Before that, Billings. 15 years across 4 towns. And guess what pattern emerges when you start digging? He clicked through articles he'd found buried in local newspaper archives. 2 complaints in Whitefish that never resulted in charges. An allegation in Kalispell that disappeared after the family suddenly moved out of state. Whispers in Billings that got shut down by the school board. Mitchell Brennan was a ghost who haunted Montana towns, leaving damaged children in his wake, protected by his father's money and influence and a system that preferred to move problems rather than solve them. Guardian had gone further. He'd tracked down 2 of Brennan's previous victims, now teenagers trying to build lives on foundations that had been cracked before they'd fully formed. He'd called them, identified himself honestly, asked if they'd be willing to testify. Both had refused. One had hung up after hearing Brennan's name. The other had stayed on the line long enough to explain that she'd already been through hell once, that testifying had accomplished nothing, and that she was done sacrificing her mental health for a system that didn't care. The brothers absorbed this information in grim silence. The picture was becoming clear. Mitchell Brennan was untouchable through legal channels. He had 15 years of practice evading consequences. He had resources and connections that could make evidence disappear and witnesses recant. And he was careful, so careful, in choosing victims who'd be easy to discredit and families who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles. Then Guardian dropped the bomb that changed everything. There's more. I hacked Brennan's email. Doc's had snapped up. That's illegal. Everything we're discussing is heading toward illegal territory. Might as well know what we're dealing with. Guardian's jaw tightened. Brennan isn't working alone. There are 3 of them. A network. They share information, trade access to victims, cover for each other. The emails are coded, but not well. I know who they are. He displayed names on the screen. Deputy Ryan Hicks, 34, with the Sheriff's Department for 8 years. Aaron Summers, 41, Youth Director at Redemption Community Church. And Mitchell Brennan, tying them all together. A predator ring operating in plain sight, each man providing cover for the others, each using their positions of trust and authority to access children and ensure silence. The room exploded. Brothers were on their feet, shouting, pacing, fists slamming into walls. This wasn't just about one monster anymore. This was about a conspiracy, about corruption that went deeper than anyone had imagined. A deputy sheriff meant the local police couldn't be trusted. A church youth director meant the faith community had been compromised. The very institutions meant to protect children had been infiltrated and weaponized. Hammer let them rage for 60 seconds, then brought order back with a single word: enough. The brothers settled, breathing hard, eyes wild with fury that needed direction. We have a choice to make tonight. We can do this the right way and watch Brennan and his friends walk. Or we can do this our way and become something this town will either thank us for or destroy us for. But we need to be unanimous. This affects all of us. This could end the Iron Wolves as we know it. The vote was taken in the way the club had always handled momentous decisions. Each brother spoke in turn, stating his position and his reasoning. Doc argued for one more attempt at legal justice, for documenting everything and going to state police who might not be corrupted. Others argued for direct action, for making these men disappear in ways that would send a message to any predator watching. Guardian argued for something in between, build an airtight case, but don't rely on a broken system to deliver justice. Force the truth into the light in ways that couldn't be ignored or swept away. The Iron Wolves were about to go to war. But this wasn't a fight with fists or bikes or the kind of violence they'd trained for in combat zones. This was a battle for a little girl's soul, for justice in a system that had failed her and countless others, for truth that would tear Redemption Falls apart before it could begin to heal. They would have to be smarter than they'd ever been, more careful than their natures wanted to allow, more patient than men accustomed to direct action could easily manage. If you can't stand predators who hide behind respectability, you need to understand what happened next. These bikers saw through the masks that fooled everyone else. They saw the monsters wearing volunteer badges and coaching whistles. They saw the network that protected itself while destroying innocence. Comment, no more silence, if you're done with the world looking the other way. Every comment sends a message that we see the truth, that we won't accept pretty lies over ugly reality. And if you want to see how real justice works when the system fails, stay with this story. Because the Iron Wolves are about to do something extraordinary. Something that will prove that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to become the thing everyone fears. The vote came back unanimous. They would move forward. They would bring down not just Mitchell Brennan, but the entire network. They would do it in ways that ensured justice couldn't be bought or buried. And they would start tonight. The war had begun. And predators who thought themselves untouchable were about to learn what happens when men with nothing to lose decide that protecting children matters more than protecting themselves. Guardian had been an Army Ranger for 23 years, and that training doesn't leave you just because you hang up the uniform. When he walked into the clubhouse the morning after their vote, he carried a military-grade planning mindset that his brothers recognized immediately. This wasn't anger anymore. This was operational precision. This was a mission with objectives and timelines and contingencies for every variable they could anticipate. He'd spent the night building a framework, and now he laid it out on the table with maps and timelines and assignment sheets that looked like something from a tactical operations center. Surveillance schedules for all 3 targets. Documentation protocols that would hold up in any court. Chain of custody procedures for evidence. Everything legal, everything admissible, everything done with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that separated successful operations from disasters that got good men killed or imprisoned. Doc took point on the medical evidence. As a former paramedic, he knew what forensic examiners looked for, what documentation mattered, what details could make or break a case. With Victoria's written permission and Autumn's brave consent, He conducted an examination in the privacy of Autumn's home, with Victoria present, photographing injuries with clinical precision, writing notes that would satisfy any prosecutor's standards. Every bruise, every mark, every piece of physical evidence that proved Brennan's abuse had escalated from psychological manipulation to physical harm. Doc worked with the gentleness of someone who understood trauma, explaining everything before he did it, stopping whenever Autumn needed a break, making sure she knew she was in control of this process. While Doc handled the medical documentation, other brothers deployed across Montana to track down Brennan's previous victims. Guardian had convinced the two teenage girls he'd spoken with to meet face-to-face, and when they saw 8 leather-clad bikers promising protection and justice, something shifted in them. These men weren't asking them to stand alone in a courtroom. These men were offering to stand with them, to ensure no retaliation, to make certain their voices finally mattered. Both girls agreed to provide written statements. Both agreed to testify if it came to that. Both agreed because for the first time in their lives, someone believed them enough to fight. The surveillance operation was sophisticated and careful. Brothers with military or law enforcement backgrounds set up observation posts covering Brennan's house, Hicks' apartment, and the church where Summers worked. They documented comings and goings, photographed meetings between the 3 men, recorded conversations in public spaces where no expectation of privacy existed. Everything legal. Everything admissible. Everything building toward a case that even Brennan's father's lawyers couldn't dismantle. Meanwhile, Autumn's house became a fortress. Brothers rotated 8-hour shifts, parking their bikes across the street, visible deterrents to anyone who might consider approaching. They were obvious about it, wanting Brennan and his associates to know that this child was now protected, that access had been cut off, that the game had changed. Victoria had been terrified at first, worried about what neighbors would think, worried about drawing attention. But when she saw how Autumn slept through the night for the first time in months, knowing Guardian or one of his brothers was standing watch, her concerns evaporated. It took 4 days for Brennan to notice something was wrong. 4 days of Autumn being escorted to and from school by her mother or her aunt, never alone, never vulnerable. 4 days of canceled tutoring sessions with vague excuses about family emergencies. 4 days of his attempts to call Victoria going straight to voicemail. On the 5th day, he made his move. Thursday afternoon, school dismissal, Brennan positioned himself near the pickup area where parents collected their children. He'd done this before, maintaining his image as the caring coach who looked out for his students. When he spotted Autumn walking with Victoria toward their car, he started moving in their direction, practicing his concerned smile, preparing his questions about why she'd missed tutoring. He got 3 steps before Guardian materialized between him and his target. No words, no threats, no physical contact that would give Brennan ammunition for a harassment complaint. Just 6'2" of leather-clad deterrents standing in his path, arms crossed, eyes communicating everything that needed to be said. You don't get near her. You don't speak to her. This ends now. Brennan's mask slipped for just a moment. Fear flickered across his face, quickly replaced by indignation, then calculation. He could cause a scene, play the victim, claim intimidation. But there were parents everywhere, witnesses who'd see him backing down from a biker, who'd start asking questions about why this was happening. So he retreated, walking away with forced casualness. But Guardian saw the tension in his shoulders, the quickened pace once he thought no one was watching. That night, Brennan sent panicked messages to Hicks and Summers. The brothers' surveillance captured every word. Something was wrong. Someone knew. They needed to be careful, to coordinate stories, to prepare defenses. The predators were getting nervous, and nervous predators make mistakes. But the Iron Wolves weren't just gathering evidence. They were setting a trap, because sometimes the only way to catch a predator is to make him think he's still the hunter, to let him believe he can maneuver his way out of danger, to give him enough rope to hang himself with. Guardian knew from his years in combat that the most effective operations weren't the ones where you overwhelmed your enemy with force. They were the ones where you let your enemy destroy himself while you documented every moment. The case was building. The evidence was mounting. The previous victims were ready to testify. And 3 predators who'd operated with impunity for years were about to discover that all the respectability in the world couldn't save them from men who decided that justice mattered more than reputation. The trap was set. Now they just needed to spring it. The abandoned grain mill sat 5 miles outside Redemption Falls, a relic from when the town's economy depended on wheat instead of tourism and government jobs. Its windows were broken, its machinery rusted silent, but the main floor was structurally sound and, more importantly, isolated. No neighbors, no witnesses, just empty fields and a gravel road that hadn't seen regular traffic in a decade. The lure was simple and effective. An encrypted email from a burner account, sent to Brennan's personal address, claiming to be from a concerned parent who'd heard about his tutoring program. The message mentioned having a daughter who needed help with reading comprehension, mentioned wanting to discuss the program privately before involving the school, mentioned meeting at an unusual location because the parent worked irregular hours and valued discretion. Everything designed to appeal to Brennan's patterns, to make him feel in control, to make him believe this was another opportunity presenting itself the way opportunities always had. He arrived at 7 in the evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. His car crunched across gravel, headlights sweeping across the mill's exterior before he parked and killed the engine. He sat for a moment, checking his phone, adjusting his shirt, preparing the mask he'd worn for 15 years. Then he stepped out into the cooling air and walked toward the mill's entrance where a light glowed from within. 8 motorcycles were parked in shadow behind the building where he couldn't see them from the road. 8 men waited inside, arranged in a semicircle that Brennan wouldn't understand the significance of until he walked into its center. This wasn't random positioning. This was tactical geometry designed to contain and control, to eliminate escape routes while maintaining non-threatening distance. Guardian had planned it down to the foot. When Brennan pushed open the door and stepped inside, his confident stride faltered. The parent he expected wasn't there. Instead, the iron wolves stood waiting, silent and still as tombstones. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, his mind tried to construct innocent explanations. Wrong building. Mistaken meeting time. Coincidence. Then Guardian stepped forward and Brennan's face went pale because he recognized the biker from the school, the one who'd blocked his path to Autumn, the one whose eyes had promised consequences. Guardian's voice was calm, almost conversational, which made the words more devastating. We know what you are. We know what you've done. Autumn Grace. The girls in Whitefish. The boy in Kalispell you thought you'd scared into permanent silence. We know about Hicks. We know about Summers. We know about the network you've been running for over a decade. The mask Brennan had perfected, the one that fooled teachers and parents and judges, finally cracked. His face contorted with something between rage and panic. He tried intimidation first, the way predators do when they're cornered. Threats about lawsuits and harassment charges and police action. His voice rose, trying to fill the space with indignation. How dare they accuse him? Did they know who his father was? This was kidnapping, false imprisonment, criminal conspiracy. Hammer stepped forward then, and something in his presence made Brennan's threats die in his throat. We haven't touched you. We haven't threatened you. You came here of your own free will, and you can leave any time you want. But you should know that we've already been to the state police. Not your friend Deputy Hicks. The actual authorities. The color drained completely from Brennan's face. State police meant jurisdiction beyond local protection. State police meant his father's influence had limits. But Hammer wasn't finished. FBI's involved too. Turns out when you transport digital evidence across state lines, when you coordinate with accomplices in multiple jurisdictions, when you build a network that spans years and towns, that becomes a federal case. Interstate crimes. Conspiracy charges. The kind of thing that doesn't get pled down to probation. Brennan's legs seemed to forget how to hold him. He stumbled backward, caught himself against a support beam, his breathing suddenly rapid and shallow. This was impossible. He'd been so careful. He'd covered his tracks. He'd chosen victims who wouldn't be believed and families who couldn't fight back. 15 years without consequences. 15 years of confidence that his system was bulletproof. But looking at these 8 men, seeing the cold certainty in their eyes, Brennan began to understand. They'd been watching him. The surveillance he'd noticed at his house, but dismissed as paranoid imagination. The feeling of being followed that he'd attributed to stress. The way his private conversations with Hicks and Summers had started feeling exposed. It had all been real. These bikers had built a case that included things the police would never have found, documented patterns that prosecutors dream about, gathered evidence from victims across multiple states. From Brennan's perspective, standing in that grain mill surrounded by men who'd methodically destroyed his carefully constructed life, the world tilted sideways. He'd always been the one in control. He'd always been the one deciding when and where and how. He'd trained his victims to be silent, used his reputation as armor, relied on a system that valued respectability over truth. But these men didn't care about his reputation. They'd looked past the mask and seen the monster underneath. And worse, they'd proven it in ways that couldn't be denied or explained away. Guardian moved closer, invading Brennan's personal space with deliberate intent. You have a choice. You can confess to everything. Every victim. Every incident. Every person who helped you or covered for you. You can give prosecutors testimony that takes down Hicks and Summers and anyone else in your network. Or what? Brennan's voice cracked. You'll kill me? That'll make you murderers. That'll destroy any case you've built. Hammer's laugh was cold and entirely without humor. We're not going to touch you. We're going to release every piece of evidence we've gathered to every news outlet in Montana. We're going to make sure every parent in Redemption Falls knows exactly what you are. We're going to ensure you can never work with children again, never coach again, never teach again. Your father's law firm won't be able to bury this. The Chamber of Commerce will revoke that Volunteer of the Year award, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, knowing that everywhere you go, people will know what you did. The silence that followed was broken only by Brennan's ragged breathing. He was calculating, trying to find angles, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. The Iron Wolves had built a cage as effective as the ones in Autumn's drawings, and he was trapped inside it with only two options: cooperation or exposure. Either way, his life as he'd known it was over. Brennan made his choice. But what happened next would shock even the men who'd seen combat, who'd lived through hell and thought they understood the depths of human depravity. Because when Mitchell Brennan started talking, when he started confessing to every crime and every victim and every dark corner of the network he'd built, the truth was so much worse than anyone imagined. Worse than the evidence suggested. Worse than the victims had described. Worse than evil usually presents itself. And the Iron Wolves, who'd gone to war to protect one little girl, discovered they'd actually saved dozens. The monster they'd caught had been more prolific, more systematic, more protected than even their worst estimates. Justice was coming. But first, they had to hear the full scope of what they were fighting against. And that knowledge would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The state police arrived at the grain mill within 20 minutes of Guardian's call. By midnight, FBI agents were setting up a command center in a Redemption Falls hotel conference room. By dawn, Mitchell Brennan was in federal custody, and the confession he'd given, recorded, witnessed, legally obtained, was already being transcribed by prosecutors who couldn't believe what they were reading. 23 victims. 12 years. For towns across Montana. The scope of it was staggering, the systematic nature of it even more so. Deputy Ryan Hicks had used his badge to access juvenile records, identifying vulnerable children from troubled homes. Youth pastor Aaron Summers had weaponized church youth groups, using spiritual authority to ensure silence. And Brennan had coordinated it all, the architect of a predator network that had destroyed innocence with industrial efficiency. When the arrest came on a gray November morning, Redemption Falls fractured. Deputy Hicks was taken from the sheriff's station in handcuffs while his colleagues stood in stunned silence. Aaron Summers was removed from the church during Wednesday evening service, parents screaming questions while children cried in confusion. The town that had elevated these men, trusted them, given them access to their children, now had to confront the fact that evil had been hiding behind respectability all along. The community meeting was held at the high school gymnasium, the only space large enough to hold the 1,000-plus residents who showed up demanding answers. The mayor spoke first, then the police chief, then a representative from the FBI field office. But the crowd wasn't interested in bureaucratic explanations. They wanted to know how this had happened. They wanted to know who'd stopped it. They wanted to understand how the men they'd feared had seen what they'd all missed. When Guardian was called to the podium, he didn't want to go. He'd spent his military career avoiding spotlights, preferring action to recognition. But Autumn was there with Victoria, sitting in the front row, and when the little girl nodded at him with those brave eyes, he couldn't refuse. He stood at that microphone with 7 of his brothers flanking him, and Autumn came to stand beside him, her small hand finding his. The gymnasium went silent. Guardian's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of everything they'd witnessed, everything they'd fought for. We're the men you crossed the street to avoid. We're the men you warned your children about. The dangerous ones. The outlaws. The ones who don't quite fit into polite society. But when evil came for the most innocent among us, when it wore a smile and a volunteer badge and everyone's trust, we're the ones who stood up. Not because we wanted to be heroes. Not because we thought we were better than anyone else. But because no one else would. Because this little girl was brave enough to walk into our clubhouse when she had nowhere else to turn, and we couldn't let that courage go unanswered. The applause started slowly, uncertainly, then built into something thunderous. But it was what happened next that no one expected. Thomas Brennan Sr. stood from his seat in the back of the gymnasium. The lawyer who'd built a career on winning impossible cases, who'd protected his son through whispers and accusations for years, walked to the front with the gait of a man carrying unbearable weight. At the microphone, this pillar of Montana legal society broke down completely. He'd known, not the full scope, but he'd known something was wrong with his son. He'd seen signs, heard rumors, and he'd used his influence to make problems disappear because he couldn't face the alternative. Now, he announced to his community, he would testify against Mitchell. He would provide evidence of the cover-ups. He would help prosecutors ensure his son never hurt another child. It was the moment redemption falls began to heal. Not because justice was simple or pain was erased, but because truth had finally been spoken and responsibility accepted. If you believe that justice shouldn't depend on who you are or who you know, if you believe that courage matters more than reputation, then you understand why this story matters. Subscribe to see more stories of real heroes who don't look like what we expect. Comment, "Justice for Autumn," to stand with survivors everywhere who deserve to be heard and believed and protected. The trials took 8 months to wind through the federal court system, but when the verdicts came, they came with the weight of true justice. Mitchell Brennan, 40 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. Ryan Hicks, 25 years for conspiracy and abuse of authority. Aaron Summers, 30 years for his role in the network and the additional victims he'd brought into their web. 3 men who'd believed themselves untouchable learned that monsters eventually face their reckoning, even if it takes longer than it should. But this story isn't really about them. It's about what happened after. It's about healing that comes slowly, painfully, but with the support of people who refuse to let you face it alone. Autumn's journey through recovery was neither quick nor simple. There were therapy sessions twice a week with a specialist in childhood trauma. There were nightmares that persisted for months. There were days when Victoria held her daughter while she cried for reasons she couldn't articulate. But there were also the iron wolves, who showed up in ways that mattered. Guardian at every therapy appointment, waiting in the lobby with a book and terrible coffee. Brothers taking shifts to walk Autumn to school until she felt safe enough to go without an escort. Doc teaching her that not all touch was dangerous by letting her help him bandage minor wounds at the clubhouse, showing her that healing hands existed. Guardian became her godfather in a small ceremony at Victoria's house 6 months after the arrests. No legal paperwork could capture what the relationship had become, but the title mattered to Autumn. It meant she had a protector who'd chosen her, who'd stand between her and harm for the rest of his life. The butterfly appeared on a Tuesday morning in April. Autumn had been drawing again, slowly rediscovering the joy that abuse had stolen. This butterfly was different from all the others. Its wings were spread wide in full flight, colors vibrant and alive. No cage surrounded it. No broken wings or dark shadows. Just freedom rendered in colored pencil, flying toward a sun that took up the corner of the page. When Victoria saw it taped to the refrigerator, she cried tears that tasted like hope. The Iron Wolves established Autumn's Fund that same month, a nonprofit dedicated to child abuse prevention and survivor support. They organized fundraisers and awareness campaigns. They lobbied for better screening processes in schools and youth programs. They made sure that what had happened to Autumn would be harder for predators to replicate. The men everyone had warned children about became the loudest voices demanding protection for the vulnerable. Autumn's 8th birthday fell on a Saturday in June, and she wanted to celebrate at the clubhouse with her uncles. Victoria had stopped worrying about what neighbors thought months ago. The party featured a cake shaped like a motorcycle, decorations in pink and black, and 8 bikers singing happy birthday off-key, but with complete sincerity. Guardian's gift was wrapped carefully in paper covered with butterflies. Inside was a worn copy of a children's book, pages soft from repeated readings. It had been Emily's favorite, and Guardian had kept it for 5 years, unable to let go. Now he was ready to pass it forward, to let one little girl's memory bless another little girl's future. Autumn held the book like it was made of glass, understanding somehow that this was more than a present. She looked up at Guardian with those eyes that had seen too much, but were learning to see beauty again, and she whispered words that broke him and healed him simultaneously. Thank you for believing me when everyone else was too scared. 2 weeks later, the Iron Wolves held their annual charity toy run. 63 motorcycles lined up on Main Street, engines rumbling like thunder, chrome gleaming in summer sun. And there, sitting behind Guardian on his Harley, wearing a tiny leather vest custom-made with her name embroidered and the words Iron Wolves, protected across the back, was Autumn Grace. Her arms wrapped around Guardian's waist. Her smile visible even through the helmet Victoria had insisted on. Her laughter audible over the engine noise as they rolled through Redemption Falls with a police escort and crowds waving from sidewalks. The little girl who'd walked alone into a biker clubhouse 6 months earlier, trembling and terrified, now rode with them as family. Protected, believed, loved by men who'd learned that redemption isn't something you find. It's something you earn by standing up when it matters most. In a town called Redemption Falls, redemption came on 2 wheels and wore leather. Because sometimes angels have tattoos, and sometimes the monsters wear suits and smiles and volunteer badges. And sometimes, just sometimes, a little girl's courage and a biker's broken heart can change the world, can expose networks of evil that hid in plain sight, can prove that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that the most dangerous men in town might actually be the safest place a child can turn. Autumn's story didn't end that day on Guardian's motorcycle. It was just beginning. She's growing up now with therapy and support, and uncles who show up to school plays and science fairs. She's learning that what happened to her doesn't define her, that survivors can become warriors, that speaking up saved not just herself, but dozens of other children. She's learning to fly. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and real justice in communities that protect their most vulnerable, then do 3 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss stories of courage like Autumn's, because these stories need to be told and heard and remembered. Share this video. Someone in your life needs to hear that speaking up matters, that help exists in unexpected places, that silence only protects predators. And comment below about how communities can protect their children better, because every voice matters. Every story matters. Every person who decides to stand up instead of look away matters. Autumn's story is just beginning. She's 8 years old with a whole life ahead of her. She's got a godfather who'll walk her down the aisle someday. She's got 7 uncles who'll intimidate any boy who doesn't treat her right. She's got a mother who learned that working hard to provide isn't enough. You have to listen, believe, and fight when your child needs you. She's got a town that learned the hard way that trust must be earned and verified, that respectability isn't the same as goodness, that sometimes the people we fear are the ones who save us. And she's got a future that predators tried to steal but couldn't, because one Tuesday night in October, she was brave enough to walk through a door everyone told her was dangerous. And 8 men on the other side were brave enough to believe her. That's where redemption lives. In courage meeting courage. In broken people protecting innocence because they remember what it's like to need protection. In a town learning to look past leather and chrome to see the hearts underneath. This is Autumn's story. This is Redemption Falls' story. This is a story about what happens when we choose to act instead of looking away. And it's a reminder that evil wins when good people stay silent. But good people can win when they refuse to be silent anymore. The butterflies are flying free now. And that's how this story ends. With hope. With healing. With a little girl who changed everything by being brave enough to ask for help. And with men who proved that sometimes the best thing you can be is exactly what someone needs, even if it's not what anyone expected.